Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Friday, July the 31st, 2020. On this episode of the Politicrat, a conversation with Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She is the Professor of History and Italian Studies at New York University. She writes about authoritarianism, fascism, and propaganda. She has a new book coming this November, and I'll be talking to her about that book, about authoritarianism, and about Donald Trump. Next. With me today is Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. She writes about authoritarian leaders. She writes about fascism and propaganda. And she has a book upcoming. It's called Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. It will be available in November of this year. And you can go to her website, by the way, to pre-order the book at Ruth Ben-Ghiat. That's spelled Ghiat.com. That's RuthBenGhiat.com. Professor, how are you? And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
So what I wanted to ask you about is authoritarianism. And I think it's important for the sake of all of us when we have these conversations and for people listening to define these terms. I think it's very important to define terms. It's obvious, I think many people know what authoritarianism is, but you're someone who has written on this in a number of occasions, and you're an expert on this. Can you please, for the purposes of just the discussion, define for us what authoritarianism is so that people are clear about that?
Sure. So at its most basic, it's any political system in which the executive power, the leader, overreaches and overwhelms the other branches of government so that you have a shutdown of the independence of the judiciary, the press, prosecutions. All state institutions can be subject to the will of the executive. And authoritarianism has hugely changed over 100 years. And so in the past, it was more one-party states, like the fascist regimes or the military juntas, where all the opposition was repressed and there was no more free press. Today, it works differently, where you leave a pocket of opposition, as in Putin's Russia and Hungary and Turkey's Erdogan, and you have elections, but they don't mean much because you manipulate them.
So in this instance, and you're right, you have this book that's coming in November, and I do urge my listeners to visit Ruth's website at RuthBenGhiat.com to pre-order this book. It's called Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. So you've spoken and written about Mussolini, certainly one of the most notorious authoritarians and strong men. And typically these figures are always have been men throughout history, as far as I know, correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly been a lot of female tyrants in history, right? But this kind of modern authoritarianism that comes up in the 20th century, with Mussolini being the first right-wing leader, and then communism, is really about the imperatives of male power. And so in my book, which goes over 100 years, I after doing so much study on this, I decided to include virility or machismo as one of the tools that authoritarians use, right up there with propaganda and violence and corruption. Because it may not be true in the future. I think that eventually we may have an authoritarian state led by a woman, but until now, for the last 100 years, it's been the province of men.
What strikes me about this, and there's been, as you point out, Mussolini, and all the way up to the present, where we're seeing, and I think you mentioned Orban, Vladimir Putin, perhaps I would imagine would be in that group too, and Duterte, and a number of other people who call themselves presidents for life. I think Xi in China would qualify as well in that group. And I'm sure there are others that I can't even think of that you would be able to tell me about, who are around now, who are really continuing on this model. Where do you think that Donald Trump fits in all of this? Because I've hear people say, well, it's performative. What he's doing is this performative authoritarianism. And I think I could admit to you that I kind of, while I understand that, I do get a little, I kind of, I guess, bristle at it mildly, because, and I understand what they say when they say it's performative, but it's very real, obviously, to the people who are getting victimized by it, as we see on our TV screens. And forgive me for sounding a little bit petty about it, but I don't know. How do you feel about that? Do you see Donald Trump as someone who's performing this, or is he part of the same group of people based on how you define authoritarianism and what's happening right now here in the United States?
I'm glad you brought that up. I don't use the word performative for the reasons that you said. It's very tempting to think of Trump as not serious, as insane and thus less harmful, as confused, incompetent. And these are all lines of thought that we find all over the press. But I think that's a huge mistake. And he means with deadly seriousness what he's doing. And for example, yes, he's chaotic and he reverses his orders and that he gives, but all of them do. And one of the things that is very bad news for Americans is that all of these guys have the same personality. The outcomes are extremely different in Hitler's Germany or Mobutu's Zaire or Erdogan's Turkey, but they all have the same type of personality where they're very chaotic. They humiliate people. They're constantly firing and hiring people. They have huge egos. But so there's that kind of chaotic governance. But the things they really care about ideologically, the spreading of hatred, the persecution of enemies, the glorification of themselves, they are deadly serious at, and they never mess up with that. And so, for example, when people say that Trump is a clown, or he's just mouthing off all the time, I say, well, have you ever heard him slip up with regard to Putin? He's never criticized Putin. He's never criticized Russia. He also has been unerringly denigratory toward people of color. He loses no occasion to try and delegitimize civil rights. So the things that he really cares about, he's been all too competent at over 4 years.
How much of a role do you think that, because in the 1957 film, A Face in the Crowd, I don't know if you've seen that film, it's a tremendous film if you haven't, and to the listeners, I urge you to watch a film like that. It starred Andy Griffith, Patricia Neal, and it spoke about a character who was really a nobody in the world, really, and he was picked up off the scrap heap, and he then became this media star, and the movie goes from there. So I urge people to watch that film. It shows on TV every now and again. A Face in the Crowd, very important film, and a very prescient one, I think, for now. But I wanted to ask you, Professor, was about the media and the way the media plays a role or doesn't play a role in facilitating this, because every clown or every dictator needs an audience, right? I mean, people acquiesce to things. We've seen we saw what happened in Germany, with Hitler and the silence and the assent and people yielding and people then turning into the monsters that they turned into, while inhumanity reigned through Nazi Germany. And these are people who come from these humble places or these places, and then the media, I believe, elevates them or coddles them or uses language that's not strong enough. Can you talk a bit about the media and how the media plays a role or doesn't in the rise of these kinds of figures in society, these authoritarians, these strongmen?
Yeah, that's a great question. Without a doubt, the media helps them to dominate the scene because, as you said, they're nothing without an audience. And in fact, a biographer of Mussolini, one of the few women, it's mostly been men writing about other men, Laura Fermi, she was the wife of a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and they had to leave fascist Italy because she was Jewish, but she grew up with Mussolini, and she said, without an audience, he's like an empty shell. So the media becomes captivated by these charismatic men who are very expert in gaining our attention. Mussolini and Mobutu were journalists. A lot of these guys have Berlusconi and Trump were marketers and had TV experience. They know what they're doing. And so time and again, we're not prepared in democracies to know what to do with these men. And so that's part of it. And so people fall into their trap and let them set the agenda, even far before they, consolidate power. Whatever they do or say, whatever outrageous thing, and Bolsonaro's very good at this too in Brazil. So there's that. But something deeper that is sad that I find, and it recurs, is the power of human denial. It's too scary to understand fully what's in front of us. So there's this syndrome, and the media take part in it. They're not alone, but they're the most visible in a way, of hoping that this person will, in Trump's case, it was the pivot, that he's going to become presidential, that he, first when he got power, as soon as he gets power, he's going to calm down and be normal. And this still goes on today, where just a few days ago, various journalists and somebody on Twitter made a thread of all the people, and they're all at big media outlets, saying that Trump has found a new tone. He's finally going to take coronavirus seriously. Although he never finds a new tone on racism. So this is where it goes back to what I was saying. On certain things, there's never any new tone because he's always meant what he says. But so this has less to do with the leader and more to do with our denial, our need for, our inability to face reality. And this also helps these men flourish. For example, the first time that Trump, his very first press conferences, when he rudely told one of the journalists to sit down and shut up, everybody the rest of them should have stood up, turned their backs on him, and left. And had they done that, he would have treated them a bit differently. But that's not in the code of conduct. And so the mistake that happens over and over again by the media, they're not understanding what they're dealing with, and they think he's a normal president, so they treat him with the respect that they think presidents should have, not getting that this person is out to destroy everything that supports them. And by the time they realize it, it's too late.
And I wanted to, ask you one or two other things here. And the language that certainly is used in the press doesn't hit the mark, whether we're talking about racism, anti-Semitism, which is a form of racism. I mean, when you read things in certain newspapers and the chyron on television and it says racially tinged, Trump's racially tinged statement, or something like that. We've had recently the issues with, again, this rising anti-Semitism, which quite frankly I think has never left, but it's getting worse and worse and more prominent. We've seen it this week with the way that a politician in the South, his name's John Ossoff, is a guy running for Senate down there in Georgia. He has been demonized in ads by a Republican senator in very anti-Semitic, definite anti-Semitic attack on that politician. We've seen also another politician by the name of Jamie Harrison running for Senate as well, I believe in South Carolina, an ad that was, that darkened his skin tone. And in the case of John Ossoff, it was pronouncing his features of his nose. This is a classic anti-Semitic trope that we see. I guess my question is the language that accompanies authoritarian cultures, the wording that these people use, whether it's these politicians who enable someone like a Donald Trump, for example, or the culture and the advertising around that is designed to kind of pinprick people, the not dog whistles, because this isn't dog whistle anymore, the things that Trump's saying now. Isn't this also a part of the authoritarian culture too? I mean, I'm sure it predates that, Professor, but I just wanted to get your perspective on the language and the atmosphere that gives rise to this, the kinds of verbiage that give rise to it, whether it's these ads, whether it's the kinds of bullhorns that are being used by Trump and others. Can you talk about that? And does that figure into the work that you've written about, the things that you've done in terms of your research and your writings?
Absolutely. I mean, these kinds of rulers need enemies. They thrive on enemies, and it's always very interesting if you track regimes, some of them quite long-lasting, to see how some enemies are constants, like the left for right-wing authoritarians, and then others come and go. Mussolini didn't persecute the Jews until 1938, 16 years after he came from power, but he had other enemies. And at times of difficulty for the ruler, such as terrible economy or, badly handled medical crisis, you see an uptick in the spreading of hatred. And so the newest enemy, so with Trump it was, migrants from the start. It was, he used anti-Semitism. The first pieces I ever did for CNN in 2015 was one about how he was retweeting right-wing propaganda that was against Hispanic people, and the other was when he did the Jewish star of Clinton, and trying to link her to Jewish interests. But what's also interesting is, so unfortunately, Trump didn't have to work very hard to convince many Americans, white Americans, to dislike and distrust migrants or people of color. But he did have to work much harder to get people to hate the press. So you also want to look at, who's being vilified and when and why. So the latest enemy of the state is protesters, who are now being labeled as domestic terrorists. And this, of course, is because of the Black Lives Matter protests, but also in view of the election. So it's been interesting to see that even though we're a nominal democracy, the drumming of state propaganda, because Fox News is like a de facto, state media machine, the drumming up of the latest, all the forces that coalesce to vilify the latest enemy. And this is something that anybody who studies regimes, whether they're communist or fascist or whatever, knows very well. And it's terrifying when you see the beginning of a new enemy and how all the forces of media messaging and start to drum. I use the word drum up because it's like a slow burn. It's really terrifying.
Absolutely. I have one last question. What do we do about all of this, Professor? I mean, as a public responding to this, a lot of trauma in our personal lives, or whatever things that people are going through. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic, and what we're seeing here, we're seeing, this very, as you said, very scary moment right now in the United States. What would your idea be, or what is your what's your feeling about this in terms of what we can do? Your advisor, your counsel, what can we as people do about this?
I think the thing that's worked in the past is mass nonviolent protest, and it in the past when such protest movements start, often, and again, these are examples from like true dictatorships, like Pinochet in Chile. But when they repress them, they find, and it happens everywhere, including in Putin's Russia, the protests just grow. They grow stronger. They don't go away. And what's been really interesting is that a few months ago, I've always counseled people to work for voting. If you are not someone who can be in a protest, there are many reasons why you cannot or may not want to do that. You can work for voting rights. It's very, very important. You could sign up to be a poll monitor. You can work in myriad ways to protect our voting rights, because nothing matters if the vote isn't counted. But mass protests are a really important tool to save democracy. And so the fact that they've continued and increased in the pandemic, and people have been wearing masks and doing it safely, it is a harbinger of what is likely to come around the election, because the fact that people have been out there, it means they're likely to return out there during the next big crisis, which may come before the election, but will definitely be a time of turmoil for sure. So, working to protect voting rights and supporting mass protest, whatever that means, are two things that have been effective in the past, and I think can be effective in the present, because only a massive victory to counteract all of the voting rigging and who knows else what's going to go on will lessen the kind of ability of Trump and company to use subterfuge.
And I would say also that I think for people who can't go out there and protest, certainly educate yourselves. There's some great books and tools. Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, I think can be useful. There are other books, but there's also, of course, your great work. And I want to thank you, Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, for coming on to this edition of the Politicrat podcast. You have a book coming in November. It's called Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. Your website, Ruth's website, is ruthbenghiat.com. That's ruthbenghiat.com. And you're also on Twitter. Can you give us your Twitter handle, please, if people want to follow you on social media?
Sure. At Ruth Ben-Ghiat, RuthBenghiat. And that's where I do a lot of day by day, hour by hour reaction to events, and welcome to interact with me there.
Thank you so very much. I really do appreciate your time today.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Thank you very much, and be well. Take care now.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. So we're up to Hawaii now in the States in terms of the information that you will need to know. And I will be compiling a lot of this information, all of it, in an easy to refer to guide in the next few days or weeks. So please be sure to tune in to this podcast to find out more about that. And also follow me on Twitter at @thepopcorn, REEL. So for voters in Hawaii, you want to go to elections.hawaii.gov. That's elections.hawaii.gov. That will bring you to the State of Hawaii Office of Elections. On the right-hand side of the web page homepage, you will see 6 rectangular boxes, aqua-colored boxes, beginning with view your sample ballot. If you want to view what your ballot's going to look like, you just click and follow the appropriate prompts. The appropriate prompts will bring you to where you need to go to. Underneath that, register to vote. If you want to register to vote, straightforward. You click on that particular tab, the second one down, and you'll be taken to the appropriate place. And you will also have an option to see if you want to check your existing registration. And remember, you want to make sure that you're checking your voter registration every single week through the end of October. Make sure you do that. It's critical that you do. So that's the Register to Vote tab. Check or update your registration. Well, there you go. So you can do it on the home page as well. Right underneath Register to Vote is check or update your registration. So if you want to just make sure, as I was just saying, you can also do it on the home page as well. So again, it's a good website. This Hawaii website, very effective. There's other things on there, including the Contact Us tab, so that you can actually get in touch with the people who are running these elections in the state of Hawaii. And below that is a rectangular box called Check the Status of Your Ballot. You click on that and you can go through and check these ballots. Hawaii is a vote by mail state. The entire state is voting by mail for the primary election, which is going to be held on August the 8th. That is a Saturday. That is next Saturday, a week from tomorrow. And the November 3rd general election will be an all mail-in affair in Hawaii. So that's what you need to know. The mail ballots for the November 3rd election are scheduled to arrive in the homes of people in Hawaii on Friday, October the 16th of this year. That's roughly 2.5 weeks before the election. So my advice to you in Hawaii, when you receive that mail-in ballot, fill it out that night, fill it out that day, and make sure you send it back in either that day or the next morning. Put it in the mail, get it right back out there. Do not sit and procrastinate on it. Because, again, you've heard about the slowdowns with the mail. That is real in this country now. Donald Trump and the phony postmaster general that he has installed are absolutely trying to, and not trying, they are doing it. They're succeeding in subverting democracy. They're committing crimes by slowing down the mail. That's a felony offense. I said this earlier this week. So you have to be aware of that. And with that in mind, keep on top of this. Stay on top of what's going on in your state. Keep in touch with the local news there. And also do your own research if you can, because there are a lot of chicaneries and shenanigans going on. that you may not know of, and you typically learn about these things on the local news or on page A25 of a certain New York newspaper. But the point is that the Office of Elections in Hawaii, the website is very, very good. It's very easy to understand, very straightforward. And as I said, you've got contact information there. You can check the status of your mail-in ballot, whether it has been sent out or not. You put in your address, you do all these things. It's a really good website, and I think one of the best along with Florida and Georgia. So again, you can vote by mail in Hawaii for the August 8th primary and the November the 3rd general election, all in Hawaii. You can contact your county clerk's office if you need a replacement ballot. There's so many things. A Facebook Live series by the Office of Elections to ask questions of election officials. I think that Hawaii's probably, their website's probably the best one. So far, it's really close up there with Florida and Georgia because it's very easy to use. It's very easy to use. Remember, before you return your vote by mail ballot, remember to sign your envelope. This is why it's important to do this right away and do not wait, because you might be in a hurry and then you forget to sign the envelope. So make sure in Hawaii, because you're voting by mail there, the whole state, sign your envelope before returning your ballot. Very important. Very important. When I return, Idaho. Welcome back. So on to Idaho now, and Idaho voters, if you are out there and you're listening to me right now, please pay attention to the following. If you want to register to vote, or if you want to check your voter registration, as I keep saying, you really should be checking it once a week from now through the end of November. Because if you find some discrepancies, you can go and re-register online and have that all ironed out. And make sure you take a screenshot as well. So in Idaho, you go to sos.idaho.gov. SOS, Sam, Oscar Sam, .idaho.gov. Once you get to the home page there, Idaho Secretary of State's office, along the top, you will see along the top Business Services, Election Division, Government Services and Press Releases. You click on Elections Division. That's where you want to go to if you are an Idaho voter. You can either click on Elections Division, the icon there, or you can actually put your mouse hovering the cursor over that icon, and then you see election results, candidacy forms and requirements, etc., etc. What I will do is click on Elections Division, and you will be brought to the appropriate place on the Secretary of State's office website. I think Idaho's is fairly straightforward. You will see voter information on the numerous boxes that appear under Elections Division once you scroll down on that page. Voter information, election calendar, elected officials, and all kinds of primary elections in Idaho. So this is a really good pictorial look at what is going on and the landscape for Idaho here in 2020 as we get towards the general election. So much to digest between now and then. So if I'm looking here now, for Idaho, there is if I look at this correctly, Idaho has a primary on August the 25th, which is rather late. Obviously because of the pandemic. But August the 25th is the first, is the day of the primary in Idaho. So that's that. Just FYI to you there in Idaho on that. Early voting in Idaho. Yes, there is early voting in Idaho. And now that will be this is early voting for the November 3rd general election. Early voting in Idaho for the general election in November. That early voting begins on October the 19th. So that's roughly 2 weeks. That is 2 weeks before the general election. And by the way, that's optional for those counties that choose to conduct early voting. It's not mandatory. Not every county is doing this, I assume. But early voting starts on October the 19th. Very important there if you are an Idaho voter. So there you have it on Idaho and the information that you need. Early voting October the 19th in Idaho, and Idaho is certainly a place where you can learn a lot of information, at least on their website. You can learn a lot from it. You click on voter information, and voila, you get a lot of good stuff there. If you want to check your voter registration, in fact, it might be better to do it like this. To go to idahovotes.gov. Idahovotes.gov is actually a quicker way to get to the information you need. You click on Idaho, you go to idahovotes.gov, and you scroll down and you will see important dates, voter information, absentee voting information. So this is all very helpful. And even before you scroll down, you can see the online voter tools now available. Early register to vote, check your registration, request an absentee ballot, and find your polling location. So if you want to check your voter registration, you just click on the icon on the front there under online voter tools. If you want to register for the first time, you click on the red rectangle, which is right next to it, and you're taken to a place to apply for as a voter. And then, you've got requesting an absentee ballot, find your polling place. So Idaho is fairly straightforward. ID situation, what the ID guide is, they talk about that as well for Idaho voters. It's really interesting, and they definitely take great pains to be clear about all of these things with photo ID and voting by mail, etc. So that is Idaho. That completes the 2 states for this edition of The Politicrat. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Omar Moore.